أفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وأجمعين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My dear brothers and sisters, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today on this occasion where we mark, we remember, and we commemorate Srebrenica. 30 years ago today, there was a genocide that took place. In the month of July in 1995, when the Serbian militia forces, they took control of the town of Srebrenica. And from what we are aware, 8,000 men, boys and children were murdered, massacred, tortured, killed and buried in shallow graves in order to hide the evidence of such crimes that took place. That genocide acted as a reminder for the Western world that never again should these crimes happen. Never again should we be in a scenario where we face a genocide. Yet here we are, 30 years later, on the cusp of a new genocide, if not already within one. Now more than ever, we have an opportunity to reflect upon the historical context of the Bosnian genocide and the mechanisms used by those to enact that genocide. And now more than ever, can we reflect upon those tools used by the Muslims to face and work through the difficulties and the challenges that they faced in Bosnia. And so without further ado, inshallah, I'll be passing over shortly to my two guests, Ustadh Sohail and Dr. Uthman Latiff, who will be providing us a beautiful insight, inshallah, into this opportunity for us to remember Srebrenica. Ustadh Sohail is an educationalist and a student of knowledge, and he has worked extensively across various different communities and across different community projects in the UK. He regularly holds study circles and reflections on the Quran, and his field of expertise is within the tarbiyah of young children. Dr. Uthman Latiff is a senior researcher and instructor at Sapiens Institute. He has a BA in history and an MA in Crusader Studies, and has also completed a PhD on the place of Fada'il al-Quds, i.e. the merits of Jerusalem, and religious poetry in the Muslim effort to recapture Jerusalem in the Crusades. He has delivered many papers in the UK and internationally at renowned academic institutions, and his book on the Crusades, The Cutting Edge of the Poet's Sword, Muslim Poetic Responses to the Crusades, was published by Brill in 2018. His second book, On the Place of Empathy in Challenging Attitudes of Otherness in Human Societies, entitled On Being Human, How Islam Addresses Othering, Dehumanization and Empathy, was published in February of 2020 and launched in Christchurch, New Zealand on the anniversary of the Christchurch mosque shootings. Dr. Uthman Latiff is a lecturer and a teacher at Jamia Masjid and Islamic Center in Slough, and is a regular speaker at mosques and universities across the UK and internationally. Now, before I pass over to my guests, inshallah, I wanted to give a small warning, which is that throughout this talk, we'll be talking about many different things, and we may be sharing many different things, videos or audio clips that perhaps may trigger people or perhaps may be too difficult for some to handle. And so for those of you who may find it challenging, please be warned in advance. And for those of you who may have children, please be advised that some of the content that may be shared throughout this talk may not be suitable for those of a younger age. And so without further ado, inshallah, I'll pass over to my guests. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, assalatu wassalam ala rasulillah, Nabiyyina Muhammad, wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wa jazakumullahu khairan to all our guests today, to the listeners, and especially to our panelists, Abdullah, and also to our esteemed guest, Dr. Uthman Latiff. So, inshallah ta'ala, this will be quite a content-heavy session, and we'll not just be speaking about Srebrenica itself. It wouldn't make sense just to focus on the events of the genocide without looking at the wider context of the Bosnian War itself. Now, anybody who's in their 40s, 50s, well, certainly coming close to the late 40s and 50s, Bosnia and the Bosnian War between 1992 to 1995 was a pivotal moment. If you speak to anyone of that age, they'll have vivid memories of the images on news bulletins. We often speak about Gaza being the first live-streamed genocide, but Bosnia was not far off a live-streamed genocide. Many of the atrocities were being watched in the evening news by Muslims, and there were many layers to the experience we had. This was the first time for many of us where we came across white, indigenous European Muslims, and that's very important to understand about the people of Bosnia. Muslim otherness and the attempt to kind of relegate Muslim from the legacy of Europe often portrays Muslims as refugees, economic migrants. People have come from somewhere else. Bosnia demonstrated that Muslims are indigenous to Europe. They've been here for several centuries. They've played a major part in building the foundations of Europe, and they are stakeholders in the legacy of Europe. So this was the first time we came across white, indigenous European Muslims. And as the UN described it as the worst massacre since World War II, it was very traumatic to see these scenes virtually live as reporters in Bosnia beamed back images of charred bodies, of attacks taking place. And it was really a time where many of us discovered our activism, discovered our kind of a desire to make a difference. And you had socialists, you had Muslims, you had human rights activists who were focusing on the issue of Bosnia. Now, our attempt today, inshallah ta'ala, with especially support from Dr. Osman Latiff, is to explore the historical context, the religious context, the geopolitical kind of pressures which were there, and to extract moral, religious, ethical lessons that we can take forward in our lives, inshallah ta'ala. Okay. So first of all, let's talk about the Balkans itself. Can you guys see the next slide? Yeah. Are you able to see it? Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. So it's not an area of Europe which is very well known, the Balkans. Okay. So it's kind of on the southwestern tip. It's called the Balkan Peninsula, and it's kind of enclosed by the Balkan Mountains. Now, post World War II, this region, made up of 6 states, was known as Yugoslavia. So some of you may have come across that in, World Cup tournaments. It was a collective team known as Yugoslavia, and it was made up of these 6 states, which you can see in the Google Maps image. So you've got Slovenia, Croatia, and the focus of our talk today, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Montenegro, and Macedonia. Okay, so these states, they made up Serbia and Kosovo. So these states made up what was known as Yugoslavia. And from World War II until the early 90s, until the death of Marshal Tito, who was the autocratic dictator of Yugoslavia, he ruled this region, Yugoslavia, with an iron fist, and ethnic tensions were effectively suppressed. Now, he himself was a communist dictator of Croatian and Slovenian origin, but he paid particular attention to eradicating Muslim identity. So on a passport, you could declare that you were Serbian or Croatian background. However, you could not declare that you were of Muslim background, so you had to declare yourself as undeclared. So that helps us understand the level of assimilation, the level of integration that Bosnian Muslims had undergone over decades in this region. So that kind of triangular region there that you can see, Bosnia and Herzegovina, that is the focus of our presentation today. By the way, that's why the Bosnian flag has a kind of triangle. It represents the country itself. So now, just to focus a bit on the geography here, Bosnia and Herzegovina itself is a very pluralistic society, has a diverse ethnic mix. The largest ethnic group are the Bosnian Muslims. They are known as Bosniaks. But you also have Croatians who live there, Bosnian Croatians, and you also have Bosnian Serbs. And Bosnia has always been an open and continues to be an open, welcoming, tolerant, diverse country. But on the borders, you'll see two very powerful nations. One is Croatia towards the eastern side. And on the western side, you'll see Serbia and Montenegro, which is effectively closely allied to Serbia. So even before we start the presentation, you can understand the geopolitical dynamics, the ethnic tensions that will exist in a country like Bosnia, with a very small coastline, with no neighboring Muslim country, and with powerful influences from Serbia and Croatia, which are influencing Bosnian Serbs and Croatian, which is influencing Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Croats. So that kind of gives you the background. Interestingly enough, Bosnian Muslims, Croats, and Serbs share the same ethnic origin. The differences between them are purely cultural and religious. So one of the propaganda tools which was used by Bosnian Serbs and Serbia itself is that Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks, they're effectively Turks. So the idea that these are Turkish invaders who've taken over our country. This was pushed out a lot during the war, and it was pushed out in the years and decades before the war. Because the genocide doesn't happen just overnight. It takes decades of brainwashing, of othering, of creating sense of victimhood, of creating the structures of violence, and creating the justification for the violence. One of the most tragic things about the Bosnian genocide was the people who were doing the killing, the murdering, the executing, the raping. They were often neighbors, close friends, teachers, classmates, and that can only happen from over a long period of brainwashing and building hate. Okay, so let's go back a little bit in history. And of course, Dr. Osman Latiff will instantly kind of shut me up at any point when, when I make an error or he wants to kind of elaborate further. So Islam has a very long history in Bosnia, okay? So it goes back to the 15th century, the Kingdom of Bosnia. And what many people are not aware is that even before Islam, Bosnians followed a particular church, and their religion was known as Bogomili, which means dear to God. And they had a version of Christianity which did not believe in the worship of saints. It did not believe in the Holy Trinity, which meant when Islam came, they were very receptive to Islam because it already matched some of their deeply held Christian beliefs. And it's for this reason that they were considered heretics by their neighbors. So just to go back a little bit, the Croats, they were historically, before there is really even Croatia as such, they are Catholics. And the Serbs, before there's really even, although there was a kingdom of Serbia, historic kingdom of Serbia, which dates back many centuries, they are Orthodox. So they considered, the Catholics and the Orthodox considered Bosnian Christians as heretics because they didn't believe in the Trinity, they didn't believe in the worship of saints, and they followed this version of Christianity known as Bogomili. And as far as I can see, it was only local to this particular area. So you have a strong influence of Islam coming through from Bulgaria. Many people are not aware of a strong Muslim heritage in Bulgaria. And then you have the expansionism of, obviously, of the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire had expanded. There were many battles going on. You have the famous Battle of Kosovo in 1389, which is a key milestone of Serbian nationalism. Okay, this is a point at which the Kingdom of Serbia engages in a battle with the Ottoman Empire, and there is all sorts of mythology around the Serbian prince, Prince Lazar, how he kind of chose to be a Christian martyr rather than hold on to his throne in this period. And it's very significant because it's the only time, or the first time, when an Ottoman Sultan has been killed in battle. So at the Battle of Kosovo, he wasn't actually killed in battle. A couple of Serbian assassins entered the Ottoman kind of royal tent area and killed the Ottoman Sultan, I believe it was Murad. But actually, contrary to Serbian folklore, the Ottomans, the crown prince, he took over by Yazid, also known as Yildirim, the Thunderbolt, and he defeated the Serbs, and he consolidated his power. But then he had to retreat and fight the Mongols who were attacking from the rear. So it was actually Sultan Fateh, let's just go to Sultan Fateh, who conquered and brought Bosnia under the Ottoman Empire in 1463. So Islam had already entered by this point, but this is where really Bosnia is consolidated as a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire. So we're talking over 500 years of Islam, and even before Islam, a version of Christianity which is very close to Islam. So it's important for listeners to understand how deep the legacy of Islam in Europe is, whether you're looking at Kosovo, whether you're looking at Bosnia, whether you're looking at Albania, whether you're looking at the Ottoman Empire. And one thing which is going to come up over and over again in this presentation is the nature of European ethno-supremacists, their kind of ethnic cleansing. The word ethnic cleansing actually was coined in the Bosnian War. Their desire to create ethno-supremacist state where you have one ethnicity dominating that country. Back in 1463, when Sultan Fateh conquered Bosnia, the first thing he did actually was establish something called the Ahdname, which is a very famous imperial decree. Can you guys see the presentation? Suddenly I'm seeing a big picture of myself. Yeah, there we go. Nice. So this Ahdname, which exists today, still exists in Bosnia, in a Christian church, by the way, was an imperial decree from Sultan Fateh, where he promised, it's the first charter of religious freedom in Europe. It's a charter which guaranteed freedom of religion and protection to the Franciscan Catholic monks in Bosnia. It was a legal guarantee, and it was binding under Islamic law. And it gave the Franciscan monks the right to remain in Bosnia, practice their religion freely. Their churches and monasteries would be protected. No one would harass them, their followers or their properties. The monks were free to move, preach, and live under Ottoman rule. And this is preserved today. You can actually go and see it. It's in a Franciscan monastery of the Holy Spirit in Fonjica. I hope I pronounced that right. Fonjica, a small town in central Bosnia. So compare the religious freedoms, the tolerance, the respect given by the Ottoman conquerors, who were essentially military conquerors. They were not there to eradicate ethnicities or to inflict mass killings. They were there to conquer lands, and Bosnia became a vassal state, part of the Ottoman Empire. But the respect of other religions was always prominent. That's why you can find significant minorities, powerful minorities throughout the Muslim world. The Coptic Christians in Egypt, even in Bosnia, you find communities of Jews who escaped the Spanish Inquisition in 1492. So consider the enlightened thinking of Sultan Fatih, a conqueror, a military conqueror, in 1462, and compare that to the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, when the Catholics are en masse murdering, massacring, and driving out Muslims and Jews. That's why you find Sephardic Jews in Bosnia with some of the oldest synagogues that you'll find in Europe. So that gives you just a brief introduction and background. Sorry, Dr. Osman Latiff, I've spoken for a good 20 minutes. Is there anything that you'd like to kind of jump in and add there?
No, may I reward you, Ustadh, for a very enlightening presentation. Bismillah, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad, Muhammad. I think that one of the points of similarity that you're referring to, perhaps, is the presence of Muslims in Europe itself. Bosnia, of course, is Eastern Europe, and you have, of course, the Muslims of Al-Andalus, and it's very similar, because when the Muslims first arrived in Spain, the population of the Visigothic people were a bit like the religion you described, or the denomination of the Christians in Bosnia, in that they were Arians, and Arians was regarded as heresy. And for that reason, because they didn't believe in the Trinity, they were more readily accepted by the Muslims, a bit like the Ottomans in Bosnia being accepted by the Christians of Bosnia. And second, of course, is the level of plurality in this discourse when the Muslims arrived in Bosnia. One of the striking things, in fact, in Sarajevo is that you have these, I think you have the second largest cemetery of Jews, in fact, in Sarajevo. And so you have on the tombstones of Jewish cemeteries a Spanish dialect. So you have Spanish dialect on the tombstones although in Bosnia, is because when the Muslims were expelled from Spain together with the Jews in the Spanish Inquisition, 1492, they had a safe haven. The Ottomans provided for them in Bosnia, and therefore they lived there, they settled there, they died there, and they're still there. And you have this great historical marking on the tombstones of a Spanish dialect on the tombstones to show that they kept their heritage and their languaging. So it's quite remarkable.
MashaAllah. Okay, so if we go back to the presentation. Okay, so this from the end of World War II, you have the dominance of communism. You have Marshal Tito, who rules with an iron fist. And by the way, if you go to Bosnia now and Sarajevo, you'll see a lot of iconic kind of memorabilia bearing the face of Marshal Tito, because there's a feeling that somehow he kept the country together. But the way he kept the country together was with an absolute autocratic rule. Interestingly enough, he allied with Jamal ad-Din Abdel Nasser in Egypt and the Indonesian leader to create a kind of third-way socialist philosophy, which was different, or not a satellite state of Russia, but similarly not part of NATO or the Western world. A kind of third way he forged. So for some people, he was quite a heroic figure, but for Bosnian Muslims, he's a character who suppressed their faith, who drove out religion from their lives, and he's a leader who really brought a lot of poverty and a real austere form of communism to the country. And speaking to Bosnians, how one of my close friends, he was talking about the steelworks there, where they would in his town, Srebrenica, I believe it was, where they would employ 3 people for every job. So it was not a productive country, but an austere communist country. Now, with the death of Marshal Tito, the collapse of communism, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, you have a period in the 1980s where a power vacuum exists in Yugoslavia. And wherever you have strong ethnic tensions, that's when ethno-supremacists, fascists, they find their space. So this person here is President Milosevic, who was the president of Serbia. And he was one of the most powerful figures in Bosnia and in the region at the time. And he was very carefully dismantling the kind of ethnic mix and the power structures within the former Yugoslavia, and replacing it with loyalists who were Serb nationalists. So this particular scene you can see here, there's actually around 1 million followers here. This is what's not, I hope I pronounce it right, probably I'm not, Gazimestanu speech in 1989 by Slobodan Milosevic, the president of Serbia. Now, it was on the 600th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo in 1389, which I mentioned before, which had kind of developed a mythical place in Serbian nationalism, the idea of self-sacrifice, the idea of Serbs as victims of the Ottoman hordes, whereas the reality was that, you know, an assassin killed the Sultan, but the Ottomans were victorious and they did consolidate power in the region, and they were very tolerant and respectful of other faiths. So in this speech, with 1 million attendees, he very much kind of fans, you know, fans the flames of hatred. He speaks about the need for war, the need to fight, and he makes a number of kind of covert remarks, which the crowd kind of really rise to, foretelling the beginning of the Bosnian War. So this is literally 1 or 2 years before the start of the Bosnian War. And it's important for us to know and understand the parallels with what's happening in Europe at the moment. You find these kind of demagogues who, you know, can kind of rely on identity politics, mobilize masses, you know, repeat myths about victimhood. We see it with the whole kind of narrative around Pakistani grooming gangs. We see it across Central Europe with, you know, far-right politicians taking power. This is not a new thing. It's something that we've seen since the 80s, and it's something which Europe has a problem with and a history with. You know, Dr. Osman Latiff could speak for days about the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusaders, and the violence that they inflicted, not just on Muslims, but on fellow Christians as well. So this particular speech is seen as an iconic moment, which kind of a forerunner to the Bosnian War. Now, these magazine cartridges, they actually belong to the Christchurch killer who entered 2 mosques, opened fire, you know, killing many worshippers, innocent people, men, women, children. And on his magazine cartridges were actually the names of Serbian folk heroes, military figures. You know, even though he was not Serbian himself, Serbian nationalism has now taken root as a symbol of far-right extremism and anti-Muslim hatred. So even on the way to the killings, he was actually playing some Serbian ultra-nationalistic songs which glorify Radovan Karadzic, the Bosnian Serb leader. And this is something which is still very strong in Serbia, which is still promoted across Europe. And it'll be no surprise to you to know that during the Bosnian War, Israel itself trained a number of Bosnian Serb snipers in Greece. You'd be surprised to know the role of Greece in supporting Serbia during the Bosnian War, how Israel was supportive, and the converse is done now. In Gaza, Serbia and Greece again are 2 of the supportive nations when it comes to Israel. Okay, so let's look at a pre-war map of Bosnia. So a lot of maps, a lot of artifacts, but when you need to know your history, you need to know, you know, your background, you need to know the geopolitics. It does require some hard work. So this is not one of these lectures where we're going to just sort of appeal to the emotions and just sort of rile everyone up. We need to know our facts, and knowledge is an antidote to ignorance. So if you look at this map, this is a pre-war map from 1991. the orange kind of areas represent areas of Serbian concentration. The green areas represent areas of Bosniak or Bosnian Muslim concentration, and the blue areas represent areas of Croat concentration. Now remember, on the eastern side is Croatia itself, and on the western side is Serbia and Montenegro itself. But within Bosnia, you have this ethnic diversity. Now fast forward to after the war, you actually have Bosnia and Herzegovina, which a lot of people are not aware of, is actually made up of 3 autonomous regions, 2 main autonomous regions, which is Republika Srpska. So you can see now that the orange section has increased and been consolidated into a single autonomous region, which is part of the Bosnian Federation. So they were rewarded for their genocide. There's no other way of looking at it. Izetbegovic, Alija Izetbegovic, the president of Bosnia during the time, in his autobiography, he speaks about this extensively. They were rewarded for their genocide with an autonomous state, which is part of the Federation of Bosnia. So the small region, which you can see in the kind of northeast, that's a small autonomous region, Breko, which during the negotiations in Dayton, in the Dayton Peace Treaty in 1995, they couldn't agree where it would go, under who it would go, whether it would go under Bosnia, whether it would go under Republika Srpska, so they turned it into an autonomous region. So the 3 regions make up the Federation of Bosnia today. So one important lesson is that genocide was rewarded. The killing, the ethnic cleansing, the murder and the rape, it was rewarded with some political concessions. Now, you might call it pragmatism, but the problem is it lays the foundations for future atrocities. And in the end, inshallah, we'll speak about the current political situation in Bosnia and understand how the peace agreement actually has laid the seeds or laid the foundation and planted the seeds for a future conflict. Okay, so this is like a conceptual map of the 2 aspects. They are the 2 autonomous regions which make up the Federation of Bosnia. So if you travel, and I highly recommend you travel to Bosnia, you do need to be careful which area you are in. So you'll receive a very warm welcome in Sarajevo, in Bosnia mainland, but Republika Srpska, you need to be a lot more careful. Okay, before we move on to, I know as something that Dr. Osman wants to speak about, the Tunnel of Hope. Is there anything you wanted to add here, Dr. Osman?
Just one thing. So you might have noticed on the picture that you showed of Brenton Tarrant's weapon that he used in the Christchurch massacre in New Zealand, Charles Martel. So on the down down on the right, Charles Martel's name. Charles Martel, in fact, is a very important person in Christendom. He was known as Charles Martellus. In fact, he was known as Charles the Hammer, and he won a decisive victory against the Muslims in the Battle of Tours in 732 in France. So when the Muslims were taking armies northwards from Spain towards France, and the armies of Abdurrahman al-Fiqhi, for example, and others, it was Charles Martel that was the one who subdued the progression of the Muslims into France, and for that, of course, he's celebrated amongst Christians for doing that. In fact, Edward Gibbon, in his work on the fall of Roman Empire, said that if the Muslims had conquered Charles Martel in Tours and perhaps in Oxford University reading the Quran, so he kind of saw that perhaps if Tours was taken, you would have an expanse of Islam into Europe. So it just shows, for example, that that's someone who's important in the context of the Muslims in Spain and then France, that he sought to galvanize that spirit of revenge and fight back against Muslims in his campaign. It's interesting also that in his weapon, so we have these names of these Serbian nationalist leaders, and of course he's hearing the song, so he's on the way to kill the Muslims in Christchurch and kills 50 of them in the two masajid, and he's hearing the songs celebrating their achievements. In Bosnia, for example, now, for example, like today, for example, it's quite likely that Serbs play loud music on these kind of days. So when the Muslims in Srebrenica are remembering the dead, the many Serbs, maybe not all, but quite a few, would play loud music to interrupt that ceremony because of the failure of recognizing the events, in fact, really as a genocide. Brenton Tarrant, in fact, he published a manifesto. It's called The Great Manifesto. And this was found on his computer. So when he's on his way to kill the Muslims, the manifesto, in fact, it reads, and it says, like, he is recalling Ibn II in the Crusades, calling the Muslims in New Zealand as Turks, like you mentioned, the Turk label that was given to them, as being othered and different to them. And the Turk, in fact, was said by Ibn II in his speeches as someone who was savage, backwards, uncivilized. He says that the Turks are taking over, spoiling our churches in Jerusalem. And so Brenton Tarrant, in recalling the names of these Serbian leaders and also of Charles Martel, and Ibn II also, was bring them all together to really seek to dehumanize the Muslims of his time, and that became an incentive for him in his campaign or his killing spree in Christchurch, New Zealand. So I wanted to add that, and I think that's important to remember.
Exactly. So now, overall, in the Bosnian War, which lasted from 1992 to 1995, it's important to understand the scale of the suffering. Over 100,000 Bosnians were killed. 61,400 were Muslims. The Srebrenica genocide itself, where over 8,000 Muslim men and boys were executed. But there were many other massacres, atrocities. The siege of Sarajevo itself, 14,000 people were killed. The siege of Sarajevo lasted for around 3 years, and it's considered the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare, where some people lived without water, electricity, or heat for 3 years. The Bosnian Serbs who took up positions around the hills of Sarajevo, they fired 300,000 shells in that period, which led to the deaths of 14,000 people. There were 1,600 children killed. Over 56,000 were injured. The largest atrocity of the siege of Srebrenica was a mortar attack in August 1995, the open-air Markel Marketplace massacre in central Sarajevo, where a mortar hit a busy shopping period around 11 to 12 p.m., where people were just trying to gather whatever basics they could find. And 43 civilians were killed and 84 were wounded. And we saw the images on our television screen. So the scale of the brutality, the savagery, the killing from people who were intimately close to the Bosnian Muslims. I spoke to a couple of close friends who are Bosnian teachers in the UK, and they describe a time post-communism where you literally could not tell the difference between who a Muslim, a Bosnian Muslim, a Bosniak, a Serb, and a Croatian was. You could not tell the difference. They had the same habits, the same practices. They drank alcohol the same. They intermarried. They had very deeply embedded communities. But the point is, they never forget who you are. You can forget your identity. You might dilute your Islam. You might even turn your back on Islam. But others never forget who you are. Others never forget your name. They never forget your background. And they never forget the potential of your children to return to Islam. So it's really a testimony to the resilience of the Bosnian people that they withstood this onslaught for 3 years. that they rediscovered their faith, that they rediscovered their history, their Islam, and despite being effectively abandoned by the world, and in some cases with certain European powers who were effectively complicit in the genocide through their policies, through withholding support for the Bosnian Muslims, through providing diplomatic cover for the Bosnian Serbs. They were complicit, but Bosnians rediscovered their Islam, rediscovered their identity, rediscovered their history. They mounted a defense. A lot of people are not aware of how the Bosnian Serbs from within the country managed to mount such an offensive. They had prepared for literally decades through their propaganda. They had armed Serbian civilians within Bosnia. Rifles used to be hidden in roofs, kind of rafters. They had preached this anti-Muslim hatred, that they were Turks, that these people were foreigners, that they had preached this kind of rhetoric of victimhood. They had kind of relied on this kind of mythical history of the Battle of Kosovo, 1389. And Kosovo is very important in Serb national history. It's the kind of foundation or the heart of the Kingdom of Serbia. Historically, it's the place where their church originates from. So Kosovo, not being part of Serbia, is a great kind of rallying cry of injustice for Bosnian Serbs. In some ways, it's like Jerusalem to Catholic or other types of Christians. But within that carnage, and when Yugoslavia collapsed, one of the things under Marshal Tito, the capital of Yugoslavia was in Belgrade, which is in Serbia. So Serbians had spent a long time monopolizing key positions in the Serbian military. So when Yugoslavia collapsed, they were able to transition the heavy artillery, the command structure, the weapons from the Yugoslav army to the JNA, to the Bosnian Serb army, and then they were able to launch their genocide rapidly. Remember, each town or city in Bosnia had a barracks already, had an army barracks, and Muslims were completely unprepared. These were their brothers, ethnic brothers. And for them to turn to almost at the drop of a hat and to launch this kind of savagery against them, they were not armed, they were not prepared, and it took a while for them to consolidate and to mount an effective defense. So I know Dr. Osman wants to speak about the next section, which are a couple of examples of Bosnian resilience and ingenuity. So Dr. Osman, I'm going to hand over to you for this section, inshallah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said about this area. One thing, of course, is that the Serbians in their genocide against the Muslims of Bosnia also sought to destroy all cultural sites in Bosnia, so that the remembrance about their heritage was displaced. It's a bit like the Israelis, in fact, in the Nakba, in destroying not just expelling the people and killing them off, but also in destroying the monuments and the cemeteries and building over them, so that the sense of collective remembrance of their cultural identity is replaced and lost. And it was very similar, in fact, the great mosque of the Ghazi Husra Beg, in fact, the Ottoman ruler, and in fact in Sarajevo they had an amazing Waqf tradition of building these institutions, for collective benefit, and many, in fact, still survive and have been reconstructed in Bosnia. I was very fortunate, in fact, when I was there, to have met the woman who was leading the campaign in reconstructing many of these masajid. It's really, really beautiful. And by the way, she said that before they began the work, they did a kind of a survey, and they asked villagers, what is the main thing that you feel has been lost for you as a people in Bosnia? And they said it was the masjid. Subhanallah. So for a people who didn't have the strong Islamic identity, still they had a sense of place in knowing, of course, that the mosque is important for the sense of being and the sense of belonging and the sense of like identity. The masjid was very key, and it was beautiful because we went to the masjid that they reconstructed, and it was very, very powerful. So I think that we should not, and by the way, we also met people who were involved as defenders in the siege of Sarajevo in those years, and they said the same thing that you said, for example, that the level of attention to their Islamic identity was minimal, but they knew they were Muslims. And remember that I think it was Karadzic who said that when they launched a campaign in Srebrenica, that he said it was genetically deformed material that converted to Islam. So they couldn't handle the fact that even though Bosnians are Slavic people, they're not different. They're Slavic people. Slavic, the Bosnians, Slovenians, the Serbians, Croatians are all Slavic people. But they saw the Bosnians as fundamentally different because they were Muslims, because they had converted to Islam. For them, that was enough as a reason to rally against them and to dehumanize them as being other to them, even though they were Slavic people. And it's interesting that the one thing that they wanted, in fact, was the masjid. And subhanAllah, it was really beautiful seeing that, subhanAllah, that the attention just to be in the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we met one brother who was there as a defender in the siege of Sarajevo, and he said that it was, like for people who are defending themselves and their families and their land, they didn't know much. And so they had to speak to them using very simple vernacular vocabulary by saying things like, if I fight and I die, Jannah. And if he gets killed, Jahannam. Like very simple vocabulary to make them understand that why they're fighting and what they're doing and this and that. And so it was powerful. But remember, of course, that whenever you have a genocide, whenever you have a mass killing, you have different groups of people that emerge. You have, of course, the perpetrators. In this case, of course, it's the Serbians, Croats, those who were heralding the venom against Islam and Muslims in this time. You have, of course, the victims, in this case, the Muslims of Bosnia. You have the bystanders, those who simply watch it all happening and fail to do anything in response to resist that. Then you have the fourth category of the rescuers, and these are the ones that we should be really thinking deeply about becoming in our lives, of the rescuers, of those who put aside their worldly, earthly comforts, and they seek to help those who are suffering. And in fact, one example in Sarajevo is the image you showed of the Tunnel of Hope. This tunnel, in fact, is remarkable. And now, of course, it's a site. Famous people go and visit the tunnel. You can go through the part of the tunnel. You can see how it was built. And what's remarkable is that because you had the longest running siege in human history in Sarajevo, and the Serbs had besieged Sarajevo, they weren't allowing food, medicine, people, animals to cross. And so, subhanAllah, what the Muslims did is that they had this amazing idea of building a tunnel, digging under the airport. And the airport was this protected zone, so you weren't allowed to bomb the airport. And so what the Serbs used to do in the trees, in the woods, is they would fire sniper rounds. And so when the Muslims tried to cross on the other side, they would be sniped. But they couldn't bomb. And so underground, they built this tunnel. There's about 100 people, 50 one side, 50 other side, if I remember well. And they began to dig. And they had shifts of digging from the morning till the evening, like 6-hour shifts each. And subhanAllah. So I think one of the very important people that we should know, our kids should know the names. This is what the responsibility of pedagogy in this time, parental pedagogy, when it comes to Bosnia and its remembrance is remember the work of Sidi Kolar, because Kolar was they built under the family home. It began the digging began under the family's farm home, and that was a Kolar family. And it was a woman called Sida Kolar, a grandmother, who would give these workers water, all the time. So as one is coming out, water. As one is going in, water. and that was her job. I mean, that was her resistance. That was her capacity in that situation to give these workers water. And subhanallah, it was done, and they could transport wires. So from one end to the other end, wires and food and people and messages, and that became very important as a site of resistance in the genocide, the tunnel of hope. And then, of course, there were other things as well. There were people, by the way, I asked the brother who was there in the siege of Sarajevo, of people who changed sides. There were people who embraced Islam. There were people who didn't want to fight. All those things, a bit like what you're seeing in all genocide, people who have more of a conscience than others, were also there in the genocide in Bosnia as well. So I think those things have to be factored in. So the element of resistance, of protection, of working collectively, of each person playing his role. Kullukum ra'in, all of you are shepherds. The woman, Sidaqullah, I mean, that was her function. That was what she could do, is give the water. And by having the thing built, and by the way, so in Sarajevo, and we went past her house, and it's full of bullet holes, and it's difficult not to find a house in Sarajevo, except that they have bullet holes. So the assault and campaign against the Muslims was intense, and because they knew that something's happening, the Muslims are doing something, but it's all underground. They bombed the house. So therefore, the element of courage and bravery and not fearing of death is very key in that resistance. And there's, of course, so many others as well. There's Mujahid, and I would also say that the Muslims who travel from other countries to help the Muslims, like England, for example, the people of England, the Muslims of England was very key, because people travel from here a lot to provide aid convoys to help the Muslims over there, to help the resistance from all parts of the world. They travel there, and I think that you would also remember that one of the growing up, we saw the videos of so many things happening, and so many people traveling to provide assistance to them, and many people from England traveled to help the Muslims. And I think that's a very important point to make mention of.
Jazakallah khair. I also wanted to just ponder over this little library. Well, it's not little. It's actually very famous in Sarajevo. And this particular library, there's actually a documentary about it in Al Jazeera, The Love of Books, which I would highly recommend you watch. And the staff at this library, actually, they risked their lives to save some of the manuscripts and the books which were up to 1,000 years old. Like I mentioned, the legacy and the history of Muslims in Europe, it goes back a long, long way. We need to stop thinking of ourselves as just economic migrants or refugees and people who are staying here temporarily. The heritage of Islam in Europe goes back a long way. And the Serbs, as part of their assault on the Islamic identity, they actually bombed and set fire to the main library of Sarajevo. But this historic library, they didn't. It's a very old library, and the staff, what they did is they transported the books, thousands of books, in cardboard boxes. They were actually banana boxes. They didn't actually have bananas because they didn't have any food, but they were transporting the books, and they transported them around 7 times around Sarajevo to protect them. Some of them were very old masahif. Some of them, were Islamic books, around 1,000 years old. But they wanted to protect the heritage, the Muslim heritage of Sarajevo, of Bosnia. And under sniper fire, this isn't just, a chain being created of guys of men and women who are just passing boxes around. These are people who are running under fire and to save their books and save their masahif and save the heritage of Sarajevo and Bosnia. And in fact, at some points, they were stopped by gangs of young men, Bosniaks, who were starving. And they said, look, you guys have so many boxes of bananas, give us some. and they grabbed the boxes from their hands, opened them up, and found that they were old books, and kind of in disappointment, just dumped the books on the floor. So even the librarians, the staff, they were part of this cultural resistance. And it's very important for us to understand the levels of resistance, not just the physical resistance in war, but the cultural resistance, the knowledge resistance, the resistance of preserving your heritage and rediscovering your heritage. So I thought these were two really nice examples which show, and we always have to be positive, which show the character of the Bosnian people, which show their resilience. When you go there to Bosnia, they're very proud people. They don't like to dwell on the war. But it's important for us to know their courage and to know their sacrifices and to celebrate their achievements, because they withstood, the most unbelievable onslaught, something that was planned for decades in advance. They withstood, and they have, flourished. Wherever you go, you'll find Bosnians. They say Turkey. They call it the large Bosnia. They call Bosnia the small Bosnia, and Turkey the large Bosnia, because there's more Bosnians in Turkey than there are in actually Bosnia. A lot of the imams, you'll see them, 6'5" guys, mashallah, speaking fluent Arabic, Turkish. They're actually of Bosnian origin. So we need to celebrate what they've achieved, their struggles, their bravery, but also we need to recognize, the savagery of what happened. And I'm particularly upset to see how local authorities are not commemorating Srebrenica like they did in the past. There's very obvious political reasons for that. One of them is the backlash and the comparisons with Gaza, which will be made. Some of them are financial reasons, the lack of funds, but some of them are to do with disengagement from the Muslim community. How many khutbahs did you hear today about Srebrenica, which the UN described as the worst crime in European soil since World War II? How many khutbahs did you hear talking about that? How many speakers speak about this? How many imams draw attention to this? We're Europeans, right? This was on our doorstep. You can take a 2-hour flight and be in Sarajevo. So we have a responsibility to these people. They are very proud. They are not going to dwell on the war, but it's our responsibility to find their stories and to promote their stories of courage and bravery. Okay, so let's focus now a lot more on Srebrenica itself for the last half an hour. I appreciate it's a long session, it's very hot, but time is valuable, and I'm not really going to take a break. Yeah, I mean, you guys feel free to grab a cold drink or an ice cream or whatever you want. But I'm just going to plow on, and Dr. Osman will plow on, hopefully. So inshallah ta'ala, please forgive the kind of denseness and intensity of this session. So if we go back to the PowerPoint, this tragic site is the Memorial Center in Srebrenica. This is actually the site where we can see the graves and the tombstones of the victims of the Srebrenica genocide. So all in all, there were around 8,000 men and boys between the ages of 12 to 77 that were executed. To give you a little bit of background, Srebrenica, which is now in kind of like the modern day Republika Srpska, this was designated a safe zone by the UN. The UN, the international community, and European leaders particularly shoulder a portion of the responsibility for the genocide in Srebrenica through their inaction and at times through their diplomatic cover. You cannot commit a genocide for this long, 3 years, or as you see in Israel for over 2 years, without diplomatic, political, and military support. So around 40,000 Bosnian Muslims took shelter in Srebrenica after the UN declared it a safe zone. They were escaping the oncoming Bosnian Serb army. The Bosnian Serb army, they launched an offensive on the UN Profor base at Potokerin. So this actual memorial center, it's been built on the actual UN base where there were Dutch soldiers stationed. So the 3rd Battalion of the Dutch Army was stationed in this area. They were armed, but they did not have the aerial support or the heavy artillery to engage fully with the Bosnian army. But naturally, many Muslims saw them as their best bet for protection, and they actually came to this center. Around 40,000 Bosnian Muslims. Now, in the genocide which took place from the 11th of July up to around the 16th of July, over 8,000 boys and men were massacred. These massacres took place over 80 execution sites. These massacres, took place over several execution sites, and there were over 80 mass graves which were dug for these victims. There were also 60 women and 563 children who were gunned down. Now, each year, the victims are being discovered, and on the most recent anniversary, there were 2 more victims that were discovered. And they used DNA identification from living relatives to match the remains and identify the victims. So the Srebrenica Potokari Memorial Center is one of the centers where some of this work takes place in identifying victims. Now, if you go to Srebrenica and go to that UN base, which is now a museum, it's really quite overwhelming. So you can see in open display the shoes, the bags, the rucksacks, the clothes, sometimes the jeans of the victims laid out. This is not just images or pictures, but the actual, some of them really heartbreaking, small-sized shoes of young boys that were separated and killed. Now, while the boys and men were transported for execution, the women and children under 12 were put on buses and coaches, and they were bussed out of the area into other areas which were held by the Bosnian army itself. But they had to endure horrific rape, sexual violence. The Bosnian Serb army manned the main roads out of Srebrenica, and at each checkpoint, young women would be taken off. They would be raped on the roadside. Sometimes they would be taken out to farmhouses to be raped. And the UN itself described how there was systematic use of rape to terrorize the Muslim community, to break the family bonds between them, to impregnate women with children, who at a later stage, could be claimed as Serbian. And in Srebrenica, you have villages which have been built just for women, for female survivors who lost all the men, who lost their fathers, their sons, their uncles, and it's a kind of small town which has been built just for the female survivors, where children can go study. There's kind of like boarding houses there as well, but it's been built just for the women of the area. The UN described, the UN Commission of Experts in 1995 described that there was massive, organized and systematic rape of women, in particular Muslim women. The UNHCR and OSCE estimate that in the Bosnian War, around 20,000 women and girls were subjected to sexual violence, but the UK Parliament report puts the number closer to 50,000. Because the stigma which is attached to sexual violence and rape, many victims don't report, and sometimes these crimes go, unreported. And we've seen the same pattern in Gaza, the use of sexual violence of Gazans, men who have been raped in detention centers and sometimes killed through those vicious acts of rape using truncheons, and using blunt objects. And it's something which has happened over and over again. It happened 30 years ago. It's happening now. And the world stands by. These things don't happen without some level of diplomatic and political support. So I'd like to play a short video, if I can ask Abdullah to play the first video. Now, Abdullah, are you there? I hope you're there.
Yes, I'm just getting it set up now.
Yeah, okay. So now these videos are not like personal kind of YouTube clips which I've found. These are actual videos from UN tribunals and court cases which have been verified. And we're going to watch around 3 videos. You know, Dr. Osman will want to comment on some of them. So the first video which we're going to see is the Bosnian Serb general Ratko Mladic, who's a convicted war criminal, who entered into Srebrenica. He gave the orders to the troops, the Serbian troops, to get the Turks. And we're going to look at the subtitles, which are there in English. Yeah.
Opuste se makar na sastanku. Ti Vox ne sjedniš. Sigurno.
Our Ustadh is what is from the compound of the guy and the factories around the compound. We have now approximately between 15 and 20,000 persons. There are still persons coming in. We are
Right, if you can pause there, please. If you just actually just slightly play a bit and just pause on Ratko Mladic there. Just play it again. Yeah, there. So that's General Ratko Mladic. He is considered the worst kind of war criminal from the Bosnian War. And he's having a meeting with Nasib. Nasib is just a young man, a teacher, I believe, who is appointed by the Dutch UN troops as the negotiator on behalf of the civilians who are in the base. And there's up to 40,000 civilians who have arrived there. Nasib himself, he looks very relaxed. They offer him a cigarette. He's smoking, but in reality, he's terrified. And he later testifies at the UN tribunals and at The Hague about what he went through. Now, this particular general, what he wants is a means of communicating and of organizing the people in the base. So the man in the middle with the large mustache, he's actually the commander of the Dutch troops who are in the base. So there is an ability to stop this genocide. There are troops who are armed, who are professional soldiers, who are there. The Bosnian Serb army actually took some hostages from the soldiers in case of UN airstrikes, but they need not have worried because the UN made threats of airstrikes, but they never really followed through with those strikes. So in this particular meeting, he promises Nasib safety for the civilians. He asks Nasib that people should hand their weapons in and they'll receive favorable treatment from the Bosnian Serb troops. In fact, Nasib, he's smart, he hides the fact that they have no weapons. So he agrees to the terms, even though they have no weapons, they have nothing to fight with, and they're simply civilians who are looking for a place of safety and looking for protection. Abdullah, if you can play the second video, please. It's a little bit further down. Yeah.
počela onda pucnjava rafalima, ja sam samo stavio glavu u ćošku i zažmirio.
To je znači trajalo cijelu noć, ta pucnjava. Napravi pauzu, odmore se pa ponovo uđu unutra i onda pucaju koliko im je želja. Onda kad to prekinu, onda samo seriju bombe bace kroz prozor, kroz ulaziti. Samo bombe.
Kad je noć pala, pucnjava je saulmala. Čuli su se ispred magacina, pričaju, smiju se. Ja sam ležu, podlila je krv podame.
Znači kao da je žar pod mojim stomakom, kao da je vatra naložena. Koliko je toplo bilo od te krvi.
Ja sam prevukao 2 tijela mrtva na sebi i tu sam čitav dan proveo. Već kad je mrak bio, čuo sam da komanduje: parkiraju tovarač, operte asfalt, pokrijte mrtve sijena. Posuli su po nama sijena.
I vidio sam da mogu dohvatiti prozor, tako provukao sam se i iskočio sam van.
So in this particular clip, we don't have time to go through all the clips. They show, I can share the website where you can find this. Actually, official court documents. These are where men and boys were transported on coaches to various execution sites. So they were promised, safe passage, but the moment they were separated from their women folk, the moment they took their bags and coats off them, it was clear to them that they were heading towards their death. So they ended up in various execution sites. Sometimes they were schools, sometimes they were farms, sometimes they were actually executed on the UN compound itself. This particular killing spree which occurred where over 1,000 Muslim men were killed is known as Kravica or Kravika. And the testimony we heard was from a survivor who actually hid under the bodies of the dead. And the killing, it's not like the movies. The shooting continued all night. The Serbs would become tired of firing. They would then retreat, rest, reload, come back, continue firing. And they took great glee in some of these killings. As I've mentioned, then there were bulldozers brought in to dig mass graves. Their bodies were dumped. And in the coming weeks and months, their bodies were moved. So there was not even respect in death. The stench where the soldiers described using bulldozers to redig the bodies and move the bodies again in an attempt to hide their crime. And when the UN started to issue arrest warrants for the generals, people became witnesses. The Bosnian Serb army then moved a lot of these mass graves and bodies around and split them up. Sometimes the mass graves were over 1,000 people. Sometimes there were just 6 people. And sometimes there were solitary graves. But the idea was to make it difficult to identify victims and to make it difficult to prove the actual crimes. Dr. Osman, would you like to add anything at this stage?
Yeah, so one thing, of course, like you mentioned before about the banning of books and the attempt to eradicate the cultural relevance and presence of Islam, of learning, from the Muslims of Bosnia. This is very similar, in fact, to Al-Andalus, where they also burnt books. In fact, the Grand Fires in Granada, 1502, and others as well, where they burnt the books because they wanted the Muslims to lose their Islam identity, arts and sciences, and so on and so forth. And the same is true in Bosnia. And then, of course, for Muslims to protect the books, safeguard the books. In fact, in Bosnia, in Spain, perhaps also in Bosnia, they began to build fake walls and fake ceilings and hide the books behind wall cavities and underground, so that the books were preserved. And in Bosnia, of course, there was an attempt to safeguard all those libraries from the days of Ottoman presence. Muslims had to, of course, safekeep Qurans and Hadith and other things, so that the legacy of Islam remains with the people. You can see in the videos you showed the extent of dehumanization, of killing people, of transporting them as if they're cargo, as if they're just cattle, as if they're nothingness. And that really is the essence of what othering is. It is to strip people of their human identity. Everything that is valuable, that is worthy in somebody else, is stripped away from another person, so that person becomes obsolete, becomes nothingness, worthiness, lacking of all worth, so that the person is therefore killed as if he's not a human being really. And in fact, the Radko Mladic and Karadzic used vocabulary like that. They referred to Muslims as cockroaches, as rats, as vermin. Renton Tarrant, in fact, in his great manifesto, referred to the Muslims as roaches, the same language of dehumanization. And really all begins with a processing of dehumanizing language. Psychology has to change and shift, so that the same people, like you mentioned before, people who were once the shopkeepers and so closely connected, don't see the other person anymore as fully human, as someone who is subhuman, as someone who is lacking essential qualities of humanness to make their life therefore worth saving. And when that's stripped away, then that person becomes non-entity. And this is true in all genocide. It's happening now in Gaza, for example, happened in Rwanda, where the Tutsis were regarded as non-humans. And of course it happens in Bosnia and other places as well. So I think that seeing, of course, the level of barbarity of people being transported, of mass killing, of all the gunshot, of all the bullet holes in the buildings, of the blood, of seeing of that, of hearing of the terror, of the fright of the women who are left stranded. And by the way, one thing that we might have forgot to mention, that the reason why you have bodies still being identified today is because the Serbs would move the bodies. So they would kill them and then transport the bodies and exhume the bodies and the bones into different sites to hide the fact that anybody had been killed. And that was something that was done again and again. And so therefore to find the bodies is not that easy. And I think that a lot has to be said about the bravery of the Muslim women, of the mothers, the Bosnian mothers, who campaign until today to try and find the bodies of their loved ones who were killed in the genocide in Bosnia. And so imagine all the cities, not just Srebrenica, not just Sarajevo, but all over Bosnia. They're moving bodies, bulldozers moving bodies and transporting them, so that the extent, the gravity of the killing is suppressed and hidden, so people wouldn't know they're being killed. And so when you see, for example, the line of all those tombstones in Srebrenica, and they're still being formed, by the way, they're finding bodies here and there, it's taken a lot of effort, from mothers to try and find the bodies, the remnants of their bodies, of their loved ones. And so whenever you see memorials, when you see memorial gardens, when you see those kind of cemeteries, remember that there's been people behind that who have tried, of course, in this case, to try and identify who those people were in their families and friends and so on and so forth. So I think that's worth remembering, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair. In fact, before the Bosnian War, there was an actual center, I believe it was in Belgrade, where Serbian nationalists, journalists, poets, they really constructed the intellectual basis for the genocide, pushing out the propaganda, deepening the sense of Serbian victimhood. It was not even a kind of just far-right thug movement. It was highly orchestrated, highly designed. And one of the things which I wanted to mention about how a number of these grave sites were discovered, they were discovered through satellite images of disturbed Earth. When you consider that the UN, the major world powers, had the technology and were able to identify graves which had been moved, Earth which had been disturbed, yet they did not have the political will to stop the killings in the first place. This is a frequent theme in history, that once the killing is done, once accountability has moved on, once the people responsible have died, then we find this great desire to recognize, to commemorate, to say never again. But far too many times we've said this never again. It was said at the end of the Holocaust, and yet there was the genocide in Bosnia. It was said at the end of the genocide in Bosnia, and yet we have Gaza, we have Rwanda, we have so many examples. And really the tragedy, we need to not just look at the tragedy and the heartbreak and the emotion, but we need to analyze the factors which led up to this. And we need to look at the real complicity, which goes beyond the Serb nationalists. Croatians also committed atrocities and were convicted. The world powers stood by. The European Union stood by. And at times, major generals within the UN, sometimes the Secretary General, prevented airstrikes from taking place on Bosnian Serb positions, such as in Srebrenica. It would have been very possible to stop this. This was not inevitable. This didn't have to happen, but it was a choice that it would happen. And in the concluding remarks, I'm going to surmise some of my conclusions about why I think some of this was allowed to happen. Now, the final video comes with a warning that it is very explicit. I'll ask Abdullah if you can switch the language to Bosnian. I do apologize if anybody does understand Bosnian, but there is some foul language which I don't think is appropriate to see. If you have young children, I don't believe this video would be appropriate for them to see. But the final video we're going to see, it shows 6 young Bosnian men who are captured by a militia group known as the Scorpions, which are a Bosnian Serb militia group. And they actually, they transport these 6 men for killing. And these 6 men know they're going to be killed, but as they are put down on a roadside to be executed, something kind of goes wrong and they don't kill them in that position. So I'll comment on the video later.
Ajde vamo, sedite u tu stranu. Tamo. Tamo, glavo i sedi tamo. Brzo! Ovako, klanjaj ti. Brže. Opa! Tamo. Kad si Srbe ubio, nisi čekao. Glavo dole. Dole. Ajde.
A ništa, bojiti ćemo ubiti. Čeporiti ćemo pustiti.
Koji budu najbolji, dole glavu. Nisko, nema priče, tišina, ajde. A kak je voda, jeblate voda? Tišina. Hoć! Odbača nisam prvi. Sohail, niti nisi prvi. Da, nisi nikad. Kuka. Pogledamo da da vidim. Ajde. Ajde, jalla! Vataj bre! Šest! Ajde, vataj bre! Ajde, vataj bre, vataj! Ajde, vamo! Ajde, ajde!
Vuci ga, ajde, vuci ga. Čekaj da malo snimim.
Druga.
I do apologize for how graphic those scenes are, but there's something to be understood from seeing the savagery of what happened. In the beginning, the men are actually transported to an execution site where one of them, the Bosnian Serb militiamen, he realizes that he doesn't have a charger. And they're taking great joy and pride in filming the actual execution on a personal camcorder. So in the old days, they didn't have mobile phones, but handheld camcorders. So he loses charge and he goes back to charge his camcorder. And that's really the reason why why they're not killed at the original execution site. Now it appears, I'm not 100% sure, but his gun jams on the roadside and he's not able to kill them, or they think of a better solution, which is to go deeper into the woods. And they execute 4 of the young men, cold blood in the back, not even face to face, but shot in the back with automatic weapons. The 2 remaining victims are then ordered to dig graves, shallow graves for the 4 men, to unceremoniously take their bodies, dump them into those shallow graves. Then they're taken to a farmhouse and executed themselves. These are 6 young men with futures, with families, with hopes, who loved life like any of us. And it was snuffed out by people who they possibly would have known, who they would have grown up with. People who harbored a deep hatred for them without them even realizing. These were people who they may have socialized with, grew up with, shared lives with. And one of the conclusions is that one of the words of advice which the Bosnians always give us is, don't be naive. Don't be naive. Don't be ignorant to the signs. Serb nationalism is just a symptom of fascism and ethno-supremacist nationalism which exists and is flourishing in Europe. I'm not talking about the thugs who are on the far right kind of marches and riots, people who can barely put 2 sentences together. I'm talking about the mainstream politicians who are fanning this rhetoric. Some of those politicians have been responsible for cutting the funding for the Srebrenica Memorial Fund, which means they're trying to erase this from our memories. We need to understand that that same hatred is in Europe, it is flourishing, and it is at the heart of what's happening in Gaza. We need to be proud of our Muslim identity. We have a proud tradition, and even with this savagery, we acted with grace and we acted in a conciliatory manner. And still today, you have Bosnian Serbs living in Bosnia who are very integrated with Muslims and who respect Muslims. Something I should make very clear, that there were some Bosnian generals, Bosnian Serb generals, who fought on the side of the Bosnian Muslims. They were loyal to their country. Another thing is that when Sarajevo actually was returned to Bosnia, a number of Serbs didn't want to leave. They respected the Muslims. They had lived there for hundreds of years, and they were very integrated with Muslims. But Bosnian Serb militia then went into Sarajevo and carried out rapes against their fellow Serbs to force them to actually leave Sarajevo. So we need to know that this poison, it is here, and you cannot ignore it, and you cannot just carry on with your life and go to the masjid and go to dessert parlors and just think life will just carry on swimmingly. This poison is spreading across Europe, it's growing, and we need to have an effective response to this. We need unity. We can't have the same sectarian divisions that we were experiencing in the 80s and 90s in 2025. We need our scholars, our du'at, our intellectuals to unify our ranks, to respect our differences, but unify our ranks. We need to understand something very important about the European mindset. So I'm just going to go back to the slides, final slide. I haven't really spoken much about the political history of how Bosnia became independent, but with the collapse of Yugoslavia and with Serbia and Croatia effectively now mobilizing for territorial gains, Bosnia declared its own independence, had independent elections, and Alija Izetbegović was the first president of Bosnia. He is a heroic figure in the Bosnian War when it comes to all Bosnians, you know, kind of respected him. He's a person who led Bosnia throughout the 3-year war. And his autobiography, which interestingly enough is out of print, the last time I checked, I have a copy, is a very detailed explanation of the events which occurred during the Bosnian War. And I'd highly recommend you read this. But what I found most interesting is that in the 80s and late 70s, he was writing books like Islam Between East and West, how Islam bridges between the spiritualism of the East and the materialism of the West. He spoke about Islam as a balanced way of life. He was a philosopher and a writer and somebody who'd rediscovered his own Islam. And he speaks a lot fondly about his early childhood and praying Salat al-Fajr in the masjid. It was clear when he started to write and he became a prominent politician, it was clear to European powers that there is a danger of a modern, thriving, strong Muslim majority state in Europe. And that is something that could not be tolerated. We cannot escape the fact that for 3 years, the European powers especially oversaw a Serbian-led genocide against the Bosnian Muslims. And I believe strongly at the heart of this was a desire to prevent a strong Muslim majority country thriving at the heart of Europe. We already have Albania, you have a kind of semi-autonomous region of Kosovo, and here you had Bosnia. So people who knew their history, knew the place that Bosnia held in the history of Europe, many of them could not see this happen. So some European leaders did not get their hands dirty, but they made sure that Bosnia remained a kind of failed state. So Muslims were not able to thrive and have a modern state according to the principles of Islam, which they fairly and squarely won in the elections. But at the same time, they wanted to make sure that Serb nationalism did not consolidate itself into a greater Serbia, which would be a combination of Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia, the Republic of Serbia, and that would be a kind of satellite state for the Russians. So what we instead have is a kind of failed state. At the moment, Bosnia And this is a gross simplification, and I understand there are many complexities to this. And Alia Izzatbegovic speaks a lot in his autobiography about the complex reasons why he had to accept this peace. In the Dayton Peace Treaty in 1995, he said, we were not capable of continuing to fight an effective war, so we had to accept an unsatisfactory peace. And at some point, he wanted to save his country from the brutality of war. But the Dayton Peace Treaty set up a structure which inevitably will lead to a failed state in the future. So it's the only country with a three-man presidency. So every 8 months, one of these three presidents rotates. One is Bosnian Muslim, one is Serb, one is Croat. And it has three autonomous regions, like I mentioned, the Republic of Srpska, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and that small region in the northeast. And in recent times, in February 2025, the Serbian president of the Republic of Srpska, he was actually convicted by a Bosnian court. He has again repeated that kind of rhetoric of Serb nationalism. And he was photographed with Putin, clearly a kind of symbol of Russian backing for this Serb nationalist project. So when you go to Bosnia now, you find people are better prepared. Young men have basic weapons training. Young men understand that the cycle of violence, it's possible it will repeat itself. But surely we can't be taken by surprise this time. Surely we've seen 30 years on what happened at the heart of Europe. And surely this time we can extend stronger support for our brothers and sisters in Europe, in the heart of Europe, who have contributed so greatly to the history and the legacy of Europe. So inshallah ta'ala, with that, we are over time. I want to hand the final word over to our respected speaker, Dr. Osman Latiff. I did speak for quite a while at that last section, so please wrap up for us, inshallah ta'ala. Jazakumullah khairan.
Inshallah, Jazakallah khair. Thank you for your words of wisdom and good encouragement there, Ustadh Sohail. I want to speak about three things I think important. One, of course, is during my visit to Sarajevo, when we're taken around, in fact, by the tour guide, the sister was taking us around the factories and the killing sites. She said that the world has not learned its lesson, meaning all those claims of never again fall on deaf ears, because there's been a repeat of human genocide after the Holocaust, when those words were said again and again and again. When I was in Auschwitz, Birkenau, we went there to speak about the role of the Muslims in saving the lives of so many Jews in the Holocaust. The tour guide, the Polish lady who was taking us around Birkenau, said that she said the fact that Syria, this is during the killing in Syria, that she said the fact that Syria is happening still is a proof the world has not learned its lesson from Auschwitz. And it was quite powerful, in fact, for her to say that, in connecting the suffering of the Jews in the Holocaust to what was happening to the Muslims in those days in Syria. And we have to draw those lessons and make those comparisons. One of the things that was written in the book Kitab al-Jihad by a man called Ali ibn Tahir al-Sulami, who was the Shafi faqih after the First Crusade, was that he called upon the Muslim Khalif and the Muslim armies for assistance. Now, of course, we're not living in that situation. We have the Khalif. The Prophet says that Imam is a shield behind which the Muslims fight and defend themselves. So the responsibility is upon the Khalif. In this situation, we have nationalism and you have nation states in many ways that filter through to us as humans, as people without this privilege of having a state apparatus that's going to, help and defend the Muslims at a state level. You have the responsibility upon us as Muslims. And I think that you made a point before about the fact that everyone was involved in this. It's not that people are dehumanized because a few people are saying it. There has to be a mechanism. There has to be a policy at play. Everybody has a role to play, in fact, in this evil, from school teachers, from neighbors, from politicians, from media. All of them are saying the same thing. And then soon enough, that entity about which they speak is going to become the otherized, dehumanized entity. And this is what happened, in fact, in Belgrade TV, in fact, is using fictitious stories was using made-up stories of Muslims killing Serbians and feeding them to animals in zoos to galvanize the support of the public against the Muslims of Bosnia. You've got to be careful, because the words that people say on media, rhetoric of politicians. Now, for example, one of the things that you would have noticed on in the image you showed of Brenton Tarrant and his gun was a top what he said, for Rotherham. In fact, that's the first thing. He says, for Rotherham. And so those stories, of course, and speaking about that as if that's the only thing, as if that's the only ethnicity that's involved in this, is used by people like Nigel Farage in his reform, party politics. You have Italy, you have the far right extreme party there. You have Germany, the AfD, the alternative for, I think, Deutschland is called in Germany. And you would think, for example, that Germany, because of its because of the whole history of the Holocaust and everything, would be far more attentive, but in fact they're not. And I speak about Germany's deplorable role in current days in Gaza, and how it's lent its full support to Israel. And what is it saying? And so we can't, therefore, and I think you made a good point about not being naive to place the full trust in governments, of course, who have their alliances in different places, and like now, for example, Gaza, alliances for Israel, and not seeing the genocide happening in Gaza, and we're fighting against that tide all day, every day, all the time. There is, of course, a need for us, and I've written an essay, in fact, on this topic called Education After Gaza on the Safety Institute website, which you can read. And one of the sections is about pedagogy, parental pedagogy. And I speak about the role of parents in reteaching the importance of things like courage and resistance and empathy, that we should know the names, know the stories. Our kids should know about the great work, like I mentioned before, of Sira Kolar and others, and those, and the Tunnel of Hope. People should know about the fact there was a Tunnel of Hope that was built in the siege of Sarajevo, and the Muslims used their ingenuity in doing that. Things like schooling. So if you read the works of Nurit Paled, which I cite in my essay, she is an Israeli academic, and says that the policies of dehumanization begin with Israeli children from an early schooling, that they learn that the Palestinians are not fully human, that they are like othered as non-human entities with these animalistic traits in them, and that even resistance. So, for example, I think the book is behind me. It's called Lynching and Spectacle by Amy Louise Wood. She says that when black people were being lynched in America, and if the black person resisted the lynching, they said that's a proof of his savagery, because he's resisting, and his resistance is savagery. So if you contrast that with the projection of civility, like the ones who are spectators and bystanders and seeing the whole thing happening and wearing their suits and their bowler hats, they look civilized. And the one who was the poor black man in this case who was lynched is the uncivilized, untamed one who is resisting lynching, and that's a proof of his savagery. It's a horrendous discourse, but it's upon us as educators, as parents, to teach our children about what does it mean to be bystanding. In 1965, there was a very famous case of a girl called Sylvia Likens, who was tortured, who was killed, and the book is called House of Horrors, and one of the lines that says that at the end of the book, it says that when the people who were involved in that killing were sent to court, everyone came. The court case was full. The court was full of people. And the author says that if people really cared that much, they would have helped her in the beginning, rather than being of those who were at the end seeing the whole thing happening and the whole court case. And we don't want to be of those who are at the end and seeing the whole thing happening in the court case, but be of those who are helping people in the difficulty, in their need. But it's about us to think about how to placate those genocidal tendencies when they emerge, how they emerge. And you made a very good point about the importance of unity, because being individuals in this means that we're weaker. And if we work together and think together collectively, there's more of a chance of us, being a resistance against those evil ideas and evil elements of action that people display, like in genocide in Bosnia and elsewhere. So I think that those are important points for us to think about, about what role we have to play in this situation. May Allah aid and assist the Muslimin of Bosnia. And of course, it's something that I think when it all happened, I was in school, secondary school. I was about, I think, 13, 14 when it was happening. And I think all of us, I mean, like you mentioned, those at least who are in their 40s, 50s, would know about that, because and for many people that was a wake-up call. Many people came to Islam because of that. SubhanAllah. I remember that when I was growing up, a lot of people began to practice Islam because of what was happening in Bosnia. And Allah uses different things to wake up people. And the fact that they realize that their identity as Muslims is so powerful, profound, that people are going to help these Europeans who know very little about Islam, but still they're Muslims, and they're going to help them. Is a very, very big point about the fact that we're Muslims, we're unified as an ummah, and we help each other in difficulties that we experience. May Allah aid and assist all of us. And thank you so much, Jazakallah khair, Ustadh, for a very informative, very educational presentation that you delivered today, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair, Dr. Osman. It's really your insight which I felt was the highlight. But inshallah ta'ala, we'll stop here. We are well over. We do apologize, but a subject like this does need thorough coverage, and we have only just started to scratch the surface. So I'll hand over to Abdullah now. Jazakumullahu khairan.
Jazakumullahu khairan. Before we come to our conclusion, inshallah, just a quick and short reminder to us all. For those of you who have benefited from Islam 21C, for those of you who benefit from all of its content, from these seminars like the one that we've just had, please do consider becoming a guardian for Islam 21C, and you can receive an exclusive ebook, The Sacred Truths by Sheikh Ali Hamouda. To become a guardian, feel free to go to the link islam21c.com/guardians, and you can earn Sadaqah Jariyah rewards for every person who will be impacted. Before I come to conclusion, inshallah, I just wanted to ask our dear Ustadhs, would you be willing to take any questions at the moment, or should we come towards a conclusion at the moment, inshallah?
I don't think there are any particular. There's some comments which I can see, but there are more comments. I think we'll wrap up here because people need to get ready for Maghrib. And it's Ta'atul Istijaba time where we should be making dua, inshallah.
Jazakumullahu khairan. And thank you very much to our dearest Mashayikh for your valuable insights and for all of your words of wisdom. And with that, inshallah, we will conclude. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.